Welcome! Thank you for viewing this webinar, An Introduction to Logic Models. This webinar has been prepared for Phase 5 EBDM teams and work groups. The webinar is pre-recorded to enable team members to view the webinar at their convenience. The purpose of this webinar is to provide EBDM teams and their work groups with guidance around the preparation of their logic models. Feel free to share the link to this webinar with your EBDM colleagues. You may want to refer back to this webinar as you build and refine your logic model. This webinar is divided into chapters. This way, if you want to return to view a particular aspect of the webinar at another time, you can go directly to the chapter of interest, without having to view the webinar in its entirety. If there is a portion of the webinar you wish to return to later, make a note of its chapter number. The webinar has a total of 4 chapters as follows. The first chapter provides an introduction to logic models and the rationale for building them. Chapter 2 describes the different components of the logic model. Chapter 3 illustrates the steps to building a logic model. The final chapter, 4, discusses how to integrate individual logic models into one system-wide logic model, the connection between your logic model and work plan, how to complete your work plan, and resources available to support the development of your logic models and work plans. Some of you may already be familiar with logic models. For those who are not, we will begin by reviewing the purposes and benefits of logic modeling. Logic models are really quite useful to people in your position, people who are working hard to implement change and want to make sure that the change is successful and impactful. The purpose of the logic model is to demonstrate your theory of change. It is a visual depiction of what you intend to do and what you expect to happen as a result. As you prepare a logic model, it generates discussion about things that might otherwise be assumed or taken for granted. It also helps to identify the resources you have available or need to support the change you are working towards. When your logic model is complete, it will serve as a tool to make sure that everyone understands what changes will be made and what is expected as a result. And, over time, your logic model provides a way to monitor progress toward your expected outcomes. You should think of it as a dynamic tool, not something that you will include in your Phase 6 application and then never look at again. As you go through the stages of implementation and monitoring outcomes, use the logic model as a tool to ensure that all of the necessary activities have been implemented, that information is being collected to make sure that the expected results are occurring, and so on. And if changes do not occur as expected, use the logic model to evaluate why that is the case. So what does a logic model consist of? Basically, there are 6 main components to a logic model. There are contextual conditions, inputs, activities, outputs, short-term outcomes, and impacts. Contextual conditions are the factors that can affect, positively or adversely, whatever you are trying to do. They are the conditions that make up the context in which change is occurring. These are external conditions about which you have little or no control. For example, a contextual condition is a consent decree placing a cap on your jail, or a new legislative mandate that requires all counties to use a specific risk tool at a particular decision point. It might be that new funding is available or a budget cut has occurred. A contextual condition is also a potential circumstance that could have significant impact on your efforts, for example, pending case law. Inputs are the resources necessary to implementation. They can be things like people, programs, money, curricula, technology, training space, and so forth. Activities are the specific tasks to be undertaken as part of the implementation. Examples include conducting training, revising or creating policies, developing protocols, researching evidence-based interventions, or empirically based risk tools. Generally speaking, activities are easily distinguished from other parts of a logic model because they start with an action verb. Outputs are the immediate of your activities. Think of outputs as evidence that the activity occurred. For example, if an activity is to conduct a CIT training course for police officers, an output is the number of officers trained. Another output might be that 50 probation officers received motivational interviewing training and 95% of class participants demonstrated competency on post-training observations. Other examples might be that an MOU is signed by the policy team, or a protocol is completed and disseminated. Outcomes are the short-term indicators that long-term change is likely to occur. For example, many of our teams are intending to implement changes at the pre-trial decision points. Some teams are striving to reduce the percentage of low-risk defendants detained in jail on a pre-trial basis. The reason for wanting to do this has to do with a long-term change, for example, to reduce harm or the likelihood of recidivism among this population. The short-term outcome that might suggest that this is likely to occur is a decrease in the percentage of detained low-risk defendants. Other examples of short-term outcomes might be an increase in the diversion rate of seriously mental ill individuals, an increase in satisfactory ratings among evidence-based interventions, or a reduction in technical violations. Note that all of our examples on this slide are measurable. We'll come back to this point later. The final component of the logic model is the impacts. Impacts are the long-term results you seek to achieve. In the case of our EBDM teams, the impacts are the same as the measures you have identified or will identify on your scorecard, your harm reduction goals. They are the ultimate ends you are striving for. Examples might include reduced crime or recidivism, increased public trust and confidence in the justice system, or reduced justice system costs. Just to reiterate this point, the impacts on your logic model are the same as the measures of your EBDM scorecard. We'll revisit this point in a subsequent chapter. In this chapter, we'll walk through developing a logic model. As we do so, we'll share important tips. Most of you have probably seen and have in front of you as you watch this webinar the logic model template we've developed for the EBDM teams. This template was developed to guide you through this process. If you don't already have a copy, it's included with the EBDM Starter Kit on logic models. In the final chapter, we'll tell you about this and other resources at your disposal. And here's the first tip. Logic models are built from right to left, not left to right. So understanding that we are working from right to left, the first step in developing your logic model is to identify the contextual conditions. Now we must be clear about the fact that if you have progressed to the point where you are developing your logic model, it is assumed that you have already identified the goal of your change target. If not, you need to do this before proceeding with logic modeling. Back to the contextual conditions. As a reminder, these are the external conditions that can help or hinder your efforts. Make a list of these in the far left column and remember to keep them in mind as you work on the other portions of your logic model. Next, insert your team's scorecard measures in the impacts column. If your team hasn't quite finished the scorecard, come back to this later. Just to be clear, we start with the impacts so as always to be focused on the ultimate changes we are trying to make. The second step is to identify your short-term outcomes. In all likelihood, these are going to line up with the goals of your individual work groups. For example, your work group might have a goal of reducing the number of seriously mental ill brought into the justice system, or reducing the detention rate of pretrial defendants. The ultimate impact in these examples is harm or risk reduction. The short-term outcomes might be a 15% reduction in the detention of low-risk defendants, or a similar reduction in the percentage of seriously mental ill who are charged and detained. Here's another tip. When it comes to outcomes, and this will apply to outputs too, think SMART. What we mean by this is that your outcomes and outputs should be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. Here are some examples of not SMART and SMART outcomes. For example, consider the difference between saying fewer low-risk defendants held in pretrial detention and 15% decrease in low-risk defendants held in pretrial detention by June 1, 2017. The first statement is not specific. It's unclear how many fewer is, and it's unclear when the outcome is supposed to occur. In the second example, 50 officers trained in CIT by 12/31/16 is much clearer than police trained in CIT. Essentially, impacts and outcomes describe who or what will change over what period of time and by how much. This slide represents the causal relationship between short-term outcomes and impacts using an example we've discussed already. Now here we are going to take a little diversion from the strict work right to left principle. The reason for this is that the outputs are easy to identify once you are clear about your activities. So step 3 is to identify the activities you intend to implement to achieve your short-term outcomes. In the example we've been using, of reducing the population of low-risk pretrial defendants, think about the activities that might lead to this. Perhaps you said that in order to reduce the population of low-risk detained defendants, you'd need to identify a risk tool and train staff on the use of the risk tool. These would be examples of activities that might lead to the short-term outcome. Now think about that a bit more. There are probably other activities involved in just those two things. For example, before we identify a risk tool, we probably need to identify commonly used tools. Then we need to examine them and gain consensus from the policy team around the tool we'll use. We probably need to develop written policy describing how and when the tool will be used. And in addition to training staff, we need to develop a quality assurance protocol to make sure the tool is scored and used properly. We probably also need to develop a pretrial assessment report that will be used by all parties at the bail hearing. In short, you will likely have a number of activities. Now here's another tip. Use arrows to show the progression of activities and their relationship to one another. For example, on this side, the first activity is to identify commonly used empirically based pretrial risk tools. The second activity is to select a pretrial risk tool through policy team consensus. The third activity is to develop written policy describing the assessment process. Vertical arrows represent temporal order. Basically, that just means that one element follows another in sequence, or that one cannot be done until the other is done. Your logic model may contain several sets of activities as shown here. The way you would reflect more than one set of activities is reflected on this slide. Once your activities are listed, it should be easy to identify your outputs. Don't be thrown by the word outputs. Outputs are simply the evidence that the activity was conducted. Think of it as a tangible result. Notice how one or more activities leads to a tangible result. The result is not the end goal, but it is evidence that the activity has been conducted. This is the output. Also notice that our outputs are SMART. For example, pre-trial tool selected by June 1, 2016, or pre-trial assessment policy written and approved by the director by June 10th are SMART statements. Notice also the use of horizontal arrows, those that point from left and right. These represent causation. The activities column reflects what we intend to do. The outputs column reflects how we will know if it is done. To determine your outputs, simply ask yourself, how will we know the activity was conducted? Or, what is the tangible evidence that the activity has been conducted? So here's the trick to logic models, if there's a trick at all. Think of each component of the logic model as an if-then statement. If we do X, Y will happen. If we do Y, Z will happen. This is why it's called a logic model, because you are showing on paper your logic or theory of change, what you will do and what you expect to happen as a result, immediately, further down the road, and then ultimately. Here is an illustration of those if-then statements. The final component of the logic model is the inputs. As a reminder, these are the resources you already have available to you to support your change efforts. They may be tangible, such as human or financial resources, or physical space or equipment. It may be less tangible, such as full stakeholder support. That's arguably an equally important resource. We're going to wrap up this chapter with one last tip. This slide shows a checklist that was designed to help you check your logic modeling work. One helpful way to check your logic model is to ask someone who was not involved in its development to complete this checklist. This checklist is in the appendix of the Logic Model Starter Kit. We'll say more about that starter kit in the final chapter of this webinar. In this chapter, we're going to share a few more tips and, in particular, describe what should be done once the individual workgroups have completed their logic models. We're also going to discuss the relationship between the logic model and work plans. Finally, we'll conclude by touching upon the resources available to support you in the development of your logic models and work plans. Let's begin with an example of a completed logic model. Actually, this is a portion of a completed logic model. This is an excerpt from Yamhill County, Oregon, one of the EBDM Phase 2, Phase 3 teams. It's hard to read the logic model on this slide, but it provides a good visual image nonetheless. It is available electronically in full size for those who would like to actually read it. More about that in the resource discussion at the end. One thing we would like to draw your attention to is the fact that this logic model is prepared in 2 font colors. This is not essential to do, but some people find this helpful. In this logic model, the black font represents inputs and activities that were already in place, whereas the red font represents new activities, as well as newly defined outputs, outcomes, and impacts. This makes clear the action items for moving forward. You might discover that after it is all said and done, the most difficult part of logic modeling is the technical production of the diagram. There are several ways to develop the diagram. Some people use PowerPoint, others have access to and know how to use a program called Visio, others develop theirs in Word. It's okay to use multiple pages, to shrink your font size down to as little as 9 points and/or use large paper size or multiple pages. When each workgroup's logic model is complete, one or a few of your team members should take responsibility for merging them together. This is referred to as your system-wide logic model. While logistically this might be challenging, it will be the next logical step. After all, your team has identified a set of change targets in order to have a set of impacts. Displaying them all together is perfectly, well, logical. When your system-wide logic model is complete, your team should take a little time to review it. It should be readily apparent how useful it will be as a long-term planning tool. Team members will likely be able to quickly identify additional activities, outputs, and outcomes that will also contribute to your harm reduction goals. These may well be pieces of work the team wants to pursue in the future when the current efforts are well underway and producing the outcomes you desire. That concludes our discussion on the logic model itself. Let's turn our attention then to the work plan. The work plan is really an expression of what you intend to do in another format. It includes some of the same information as your logic model, such as your impacts, outcomes, and activities. It also includes some additional information, such as the person or persons responsible for your activities. One of the advantages of the work plan is that it will provide room for a more detailed description of your activities, if this is needed or desired. Each work group should complete work plans for their change target, but unlike the logic model, the work plans do not have to be merged. They can be put together one after the other as a sort of master work plan. As we talk through the work plan, just a reminder that we are speaking to individual work groups and their change targets. At the top of the work plan, note the impacts your change target is intended to affect. Next, note the first outcome from your logic model, and then the activities that will lead to the outcome. For each activity, note the expected date of completion. Next, you can transfer inputs from your logic model to your work plan and add information about the person who will lead each activity, other persons responsible, resources needed, and how stakeholders will partner to complete the activity. Finally, you will consider the contextual conditions from your logic model in order to outline in your work plan any potential barriers and strategies necessary to address identified barriers. Once the first outcome is outlined in your work plan, move on to the next outcome and follow the same steps to continue to complete your work plan. Finally, a few resources as you work on your logic model and work plan. First, the project team has a starter kit on logic models. If you haven't seen this already and want something you can read about logic models, as opposed to watching this webinar again, please contact your local coordinator. They all have copies of this document. Alternatively, you can pull the documents down from the web at the address shown on the slide. Second, you should have already received the work plan template we just reviewed. If not, please contact your local coordinator. Third, your TA provider is a resource to you. Don't hesitate to call upon them to coach you through the logic model and work plan. Likewise, they can be a resource to you by reviewing your drafts and providing feedback. Finally, Rochelle Ramirez, the EBDM Initiative Manager, has access to the documents and tools referenced here. If you are having trouble locating any of them, please contact her. Thank you for participating in this webinar. Good luck! We look forward to seeing your finished products.